November 12, 1943. Combined Operations Headquarters, London. The cigarette smoke hung thick in the war room, curling around the beam of light projecting onto the wall-mounted map of northern France. Major General Arthur Coningham leaned forward in his chair, his knuckles white against the mahogany table edge, staring at the coloured pins marking proposed fuel depots across the Normandy coast. Each pin represented a promise the Allies couldn't keep, not yet, anyway. "Gentlemen," Admiral Louis Mountbatten's voice cut through the murmur of conversation, "we have a problem that could lose us the war before we set foot on French soil." The room fell silent. Outside, London's evening traffic rumbled through the blackout, but inside this converted Georgian townhouse, 30 of Britain's finest military minds focused on a single, terrifying number scrawled across the blackboard: 1 million. 1 million gallons of petroleum per day. That's what the planners estimated they'd need to keep the invasion force moving once if they established a beachhead in France. 1 million gallons to fuel the tanks, trucks, aircraft, and generators that would carry the fight to Berlin. And right now, sitting in this smoke-filled room on a cold November night, no one had the faintest idea how to deliver it. Commander Edward Ellsberg, on loan from the US Navy, stood and walked to the map. His engineer's mind had spent the last 6 weeks calculating, recalculating, and then calculating again. The numbers never lied, and right now, they were screaming disaster. "Transport ships," he began, tapping the English Channel with his pointer, "can carry approximately 3,000 tons each. We'd need hundreds of them, running continuously, exposed to U-boats, mines, and Luftwaffe bombers every single crossing." He paused, letting the weight of it settle. "And even if we accept those losses, which would be catastrophic, we'd still need to offload them at makeshift ports under enemy fire, pump the fuel into temporary storage, then truck it inland." Ellsberg's pointer traced the invasion route. 22 miles of open water. Tides running 6 knots. November to March, storms that can snap a destroyer's spine. And Jerry watching every move we make. Group Captain Donald Bennett, head of RAF Pathfinder Force, stubbed out his cigarette with more force than necessary. "So what you're telling us, Commander, is that we can put 1 million men on French beaches, but we can't keep them supplied long enough to matter." "That's exactly what I'm telling you." In the corner of the room, a man who'd been silent throughout the briefing cleared his throat. Arthur Hartley was nobody's idea of a military hero. At 53, with round spectacles perched on a prominent nose and a rumpled civilian suit that looked like he'd slept in it, he resembled an absent-minded professor more than the chief engineer of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. But when Hartley spoke, men who commanded armies listened. "There might be another way." Mountbatten's eyebrow arched. "I'm listening." Hartley approached the map, his worn leather briefcase clutched under one arm. He set it on the table and withdrew a roll of technical drawings, spreading them across the polished wood. The diagrams showed something that looked like industrial madness: a 3-inch steel pipeline, running along the seabed, stretching from the Isle of Wight to the Normandy coast. "A pipeline," Hartley said simply. "Under the channel." The silence that followed wasn't thoughtful consideration, it was stunned disbelief. Bennett recovered first. "Under the channel? Have you lost your mind? The channel isn't a placid lake, man. It's a maelstrom. Tides that could tear steel apart. German patrol boats. The pipeline would be 20-some miles long, lying on the bottom where we can't repair it, can't even see it dash." "Where the Germans can't see it either," Hartley interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "Where U-boats can't sink it. Where the Luftwaffe can't bomb it. Where tides and weather don't matter once it's laid." Ellsberg moved closer to the drawings, his engineer's eye-catching details others missed. "The pressure differentials alone would be dash." "Solvable," Hartley said. "We pump from shore stations on both sides. The pipe's steel, 3-inch bore, lead-wrapped and protected. We've already solved similar problems in the Persian Gulf oil fields. The technology exists. We just need to scale it up and do it fast." Mountbatten picked up one of the drawings, holding it to the light. You could see him calculating, weighing the impossible against the desperate. "How long?" 6 months from approval to first flow." "That's impossible." "So is D-Day, Admiral. Yet here we are planning it." The room erupted. Voices overlapped, some calling it genius, others calling it suicide. Major General Frederick Morgan, chief planner for the invasion, demanded technical specifications. Navy officers argued about laying procedures. RAF representatives questioned air cover during construction. But beneath the chaos, something was shifting. The impossible was becoming merely improbable. The improbable was becoming, maybe. Hartley pulled out another drawing, this one showing a massive drum 70 feet in diameter mounted on what looked like a floating barge. We wind the pipe on these drums, float them across, and unreel as we go. We've been experimenting with flexible pipe designs that can handle the stresses. We call it Hamel-Hartley Anglo-Iranian Mobile Ellis-Loberg. Catchy, Bennett muttered, but he was leaning in now, studying the design. There's more, Hartley continued. He pulled out a second design, this one for a rigid steel pipe that would be laid in sections. We're developing two systems. Hamel for the flexible approach, and Pluto pipeline under the ocean for the rigid design. Redundancy. If one fails, we have the other. Coningham stood, his chair scraping against the floor. You're talking about industrial engineering on a scale that's never been attempted. In a war zone. Under enemy observation. With materials we barely have enough of. With ships we need for other operations. With everything we've got, Mountbatten cut him off. The Admiral's face was set. That look his subordinates had learned meant a decision was coming. Because if we don't solve this, gentlemen, we're not invading France in 1944. We're not invading France in 1945. We're bleeding out in the Atlantic while Stalin takes Berlin alone. He turned to Hartley. You're certain this can work? Hartley met his gaze without flinching. No. But I'm certain trying it is better than the alternative. How much will it cost? Everything we can throw at it. And if it fails? Then we've lost 6 months and some pipe. But if we don't try and the invasion stalls for lack of fuel, we've lost the war. The room went quiet again, but this time the silence was different. This was the silence of men who just glimpsed a lifeline, however unlikely, however fragile. Mountbatten picked up his pen and pulled a requisition form across the table. Commander Ellsberg, you're now seconded to what we're calling Operation PLUTO. Major General Morgan, you'll provide whatever resources Engineer Hartley needs priority 1. Group Captain Bennett, I want air reconnaissance of every foot of seabed between here and France. Survey crews start next week. His pen scratched across the paper, authorizing funds, manpower, materials. Gentlemen, we're going to do something the Royal Navy has never done before. We're going to turn the English Channel into a fuel pump. Outside the window, the November rain began to fall, pattering against the blackout curtains. Somewhere across that 22 miles of dark water, German sentries walked their posts, unaware that beneath the waves they watched, British engineers were about to attempt the impossible. Hartley gathered his drawings, his hands steady despite the weight of what he'd just taken on. 6 months to design, test, manufacture, and deploy a technology that existed only in his imagination and on these blue-lined papers. 6 months to solve a problem that petroleum engineers said couldn't be solved. 6 months to lay a pipeline where no pipeline had ever been laid. The meeting broke up, officers dispersing into the London night to set in motion the machinery of war. But Hartley remained, standing at the map, his finger tracing that 22-mile gap that separated victory from defeat. It'll work, he said to no one in particular. It had to. Because in 6 months, give or take, millions of young men would wade onto French beaches expecting the fuel that would carry them to Berlin. And Arthur Hartley, absent-minded engineer with the rumpled suit and round spectacles, had just promised to deliver it through a steel pipe laid across the floor of the English Channel. The cigarette smoke had cleared. The war room was empty. But the work was just beginning. December 3rd, 1943. Siemens Brothers Cable Works, Woolwich, southeast London. The factory floor shook with the rhythm of war production. 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, the massive cable-laying drums turned and groaned as steel pipe emerged from the extrusion machines like industrial serpents. The air tasted of hot metal and machine oil, and the noise was enough to rattle your teeth. Arthur Hartley stood on the catwalk above the production line, watching a section of 3-inch steel pipe receive its lead sheathing. Below him, Bernard Ellis, the project's metallurgical engineer, was arguing with a foreman about tensile strength. Ellis had to shout to be heard. "I don't care what the specifications say. That weld won't hold at 60 fathoms with 6-knot tides trying to tear it apart." The foreman, a Scotsman named McGregor who'd been welding ships since before the Great War, jabbed a thick finger at the pipe. "I've been laying submarine cable for 20 years, and I'm telling you, this isn't cable," Ellis shot back. "Cable doesn't have to maintain pressure. Cable doesn't have petroleum running through it at 200 pounds per square inch. Cable doesn't Gentlemen." Hartley's voice carried over the din without him raising it. Both men looked up. "McGregor, show me the weld." They descended to the factory floor, where the latest test section lay cooling on steel supports. Hartley knelt, running his fingers along the seam where 2 pipe sections had been joined. In the harsh industrial lighting, you could see the irregularity subtle, but there. "Ellis is right," Hartley said finally. "This won't do." McGregor's face darkened. "Mr. Hartley, we're running 3 shifts already. If we add another inspection phase We're not adding inspection. We're changing the process." Hartley stood, brushing metal filings from his trousers. "Get me John Loberg." Loberg arrived 20 minutes later, his Norwegian accent still thick despite 15 years in Britain. He was the pipeline welder they'd brought in from the North Sea oil operations, a man who could lay pipe in conditions that would kill lesser craftsmen. He studied the weld in silence, then nodded slowly. "Needs to be done underwater," he said simply. Ellis blinked. "What?" "If it's going to sit underwater, weld it underwater. Different thermal dynamics. Metal behaves differently when it's submerged and cooling. I can train welders in a week." Hartley and Ellis exchanged glances. "That's Ellis began." "Brilliant," Hartley finished. "McGregor, clear Bay 7. We're installing test tanks by tomorrow morning. Loberg, start selecting your team." This was how it went, day after day, week after week. A problem emerged, got solved, revealed another problem. The clock was always ticking. D-Day was coming, no one knew exactly when, but the invasion planners were working backward from summer weather patterns, and summer was only 6 months away. January 15th, 1944. Sandown Bay, Isle of Wight. The water was so cold it felt like knives. Lieutenant Commander Peter Keeble of the Royal Navy Volunteer Reserve stood waist-deep in the January surf, watching a team of divers plant marking buoys along the proposed pipeline route. The wind came straight off the channel, cutting through his greatcoat like it wasn't there. Temperatures 4 degrees Celsius, his second-in-command, Sub-Lieutenant Davies, called out from the survey boat. Currents running at 3 knots. Visibility underwater is about 6 feet. "Wonderful," Keeble muttered. These were the conditions they'd be working in. These, and worse. The Pluto project had commandeered this stretch of coastline, turning the quiet seaside resort into a military-industrial complex. Concrete pumping stations were rising from the beach, their foundations driven deep into the sand. Warehouses held thousands of tons of steel pipe, coiled like massive springs. And everywhere, men worked, soldiers, engineers, civilian contractors, all racing against a deadline that felt like a physical weight. A truck rumbled onto the beach, and Hartley climbed out, followed by a man in a Royal Engineers uniform. Captain Henry Passmore, one of Montgomery's logistics officers, had been seconded to Pluto to coordinate with the invasion planners. "Keeble," Hartley called. "How's the seabed survey coming?" Keeble waded back to shore, his boots squelching. "Mixed news. The bottom's mostly sand and gravel, good for laying pipe. But there's a trench about 8 miles out, drops to 90 fathoms. We'll need additional anchoring there." Passmore consulted his waterproof map. "How much additional time does that add?" "Could be days. Could be weeks, depending on conditions when we lay." "We don't have weeks," Passmore said flatly. "The invasion timetable is already compressed. If Pluto isn't operational by D+30 then the Army's stall," Hartley finished. "Yes, Captain, we're aware. That's why we're standing in 4-degree water in January instead of sitting by a warm fire." A shout came from the survey boat. One of the divers had surfaced, waving urgently. Davies helped haul him aboard, and even from shore, you could see something was wrong. Keeble grabbed a radio. "What is it?" Davies's voice crackled back. "You need to see this, sir. There's something down there." The something turned out to be the wreck of a German E-boat, sunk during a raid the previous autumn. It lay directly across their planned pipeline route, a twisted mass of steel 30 feet down. "Can we go around it?" Passmore asked. The dive supervisor, a grizzled chief petty officer named Brennan, shook his head. "Not without adding 2 miles to the route. And there's no guarantee we won't find more wrecks. The channel's a graveyard, sir." "Then we cut it up and move it," Hartley said. Brennan stared at him. "That's a week's work, minimum. Underwater cutting torches, lift bags, the whole operation. And that's assuming the weather holds." "Then we'd better get started." What followed was a brutal week of round-the-clock salvage operations. Divers descended in shifts, working in near-zero visibility, cutting through German steel with underwater torches that turned the water into a soup of rust and sediment. 2 men got the bends. One nearly drowned when his air line tangled in the wreckage. But slowly, piece by piece, the E-boat came apart. Meanwhile, back at Woolwich, the Hamel system was having its own problems. February 2nd, 1944. Thames Estuary Test Site. The giant drum, 70 feet across and weighing 40 tons, sat on a converted barge that looked entirely too small to hold it. Inside the drum, wound in careful layers, was 2 miles of flexible steel pipeline. Hartley's other approach to the problem. Chief Engineer Marcus Webb, borrowed from the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company's Persian operations, supervised the test crew from a small tugboat. He'd spent the last 3 months perfecting the pipe's flexibility, adding layers of steel wire armor over a lead core, making it strong enough to withstand channel conditions but flexible enough to coil. "All right," Webb called through a megaphone. "Let's see if this bloody thing works. Start unreeling." The barge's winch engaged with a clank and whine. The drum began to rotate. Pipe emerged from its edge, sliding down a ramp into the grey Thames water. 10 feet. 20. 50. "Looking good," someone called. At 100 feet, the pipe suddenly kinked, bending at an angle that made every engineer present wince. "Stop! Stop!" Webb shouted. But the winch operator couldn't stop fast enough. The kink tightened, metal screaming, and then cracked. The pipe burst. Petroleum sprayed across the water surface, creating an oily rainbow sheen. "Shut it down. Cut the pump." The drum stopped rotating. The burst pipe hung in the water, fuel still leaking from the rupture. Webb stood in silence, watching weeks of work literally floating away on the tide. Hartley arrived an hour later, having driven from London at dangerous speed. He found Webb sitting on the dock, smoking a cigarette with hands that trembled slightly. "The winding tension was too high," Webb said without looking up. "The pipe couldn't handle the stress of both being coiled and being pressurized. I should have seen it." Hartley sat beside him. "How long to fix it?" 3 weeks to manufacture new pipe with different armor patterns. Another week to test. That's if we're lucky. We're never lucky. Hartley lit his own cigarette. But we're persistent. Start the modifications today. Webb finally looked at him. "Arthur, what if this doesn't work? What if we're chasing something that's fundamentally impossible? Then we try the rigid pipe system. And if that doesn't work, we try something else. Failure isn't losing a test, Marcus. Failure is stopping." March 10th, 1944. Combined Operations Headquarters, London. The project review meeting was tense. Mountbatten sat at the head of the table, flanked by American officers who'd been read into Pluto's existence. General Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied Forces, had sent his deputy, General Walter Bedell Smith, to assess whether Pluto would be ready. Smith didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Mr. Hartley, I'm going to be blunt. We're 8 weeks from the invasion, maybe less. I need to know, can you deliver?" Hartley spread his charts and production figures across the table. The rigid Pluto system is ready for deployment. We've manufactured 70 miles of pipe. The pumping stations at Sandown and Dungeness are operational. The cable-laying ships have been modified and are running trials. We've solved the underwater welding problems, the pressure differential problems, and the anchoring problems. And Hamill? Smith pressed. Still experiencing difficulties with the flexible design. But we're not depending on it. Pluto is the primary system. Hamill is backup. So you're putting all your eggs in one basket? I'm putting our eggs in the basket that works, General. Smith studied him for a long moment. Eisenhower's deputy had a reputation for crushing optimism with cold logistics. All right. You've got until D-Day to prove it. But understand this, if your pipeline fails, men die. If it fails spectacularly, the invasion could fail. That's not hyperbole, Mr. Hartley. That's arithmetic. I understand, General. Do you? Smith leaned forward. Because I don't think you do. I've seen the fuel consumption projections for Normandy. Once we break out of the beachhead, if we break out Patton's Third Army alone will burn through 1 million gallons every 2 days. Montgomery's 21st Army Group, another 1 million. The Tactical Air Forces, 500,000. We're not talking about keeping a few trucks running. We're talking about sustaining the largest military operation in human history. The room was silent except for the ticking of the wall clock. Your pipeline has to deliver 1 million gallons per day, Smith continued. Not on paper. Not in theory. In practice, in combat conditions, while the Wehrmacht is actively trying to kill everyone involved. Can you do that? Hartley met his gaze without flinching. Yes, General. We can. Then God help you, because if you're wrong, God help us all. April 20th, 1944. Sandown Beach, Isle of Wight. The test run was scheduled for midnight. Under cover of darkness, the cable-laying ship HMS Latimer would pay out the first operational section of Pluto a 5-mile stretch to a marker buoy in the channel. If it worked, they'd know the system could handle the full 22-mile run to France. Keeble stood on Latimer's deck, watching the massive drum of pipe rotate in the ship's spotlights. The night was clear, stars visible overhead, bombing weather, the RAF boys called it. Somewhere up there, Allied aircraft were heading toward Germany. Down here, a different kind of war was being fought. Pipe tension nominal, a technician called. Flow rate steady, another reported. Water depth 60 feet and holding. Hartley was in the ship's radio room, monitoring reports from the shore pumping station. His voice came over the bridge speaker, pressures climbing. 90 psi. 100. 110. Keeble watched the pipe disappear into the black water. They'd painted it dark gray, impossible to see even in daylight. In the darkness, it was just a darker shadow against the waves. 1 mile paid out, the deck officer announced. 2 miles. 3 miles. The ship crept forward, unreeling pipe at a walking pace. On shore, the pumping station's diesel engines throbbed steadily, pushing petroleum through the line. Every gauge was watched. Every pressure fluctuation noted. 1 failure, 1 rupture, and they'd have to start over. For miles, Keeble said quietly. Come on, hold together. 5 miles, the deck officer called. We've reached the marker buoy. A ragged cheer went up from the crew. Keeble allowed himself a small smile. Status check. All stations report. Shore station nominal. Pipe integrity good. No leaks detected. Flow rate holding at design specifications. Hartley's voice crackled over the radio, and you could hear the relief in it. Gentlemen, we have a working pipeline. But they weren't celebrating yet. 5 miles was good. 22 miles was the real test. And that test would come with German guns watching, with mines in the water, with everything that could go wrong going wrong. Keeble looked toward France, invisible beyond the darkness. Somewhere over there, German engineers were building obstacles, planting mines, preparing to repel the invasion. They didn't know about Pluto. They couldn't imagine that their enemies were about to lay a fuel pipeline across the seafloor. The element of surprise was complete. But surprise only lasted until the first pipe section reached French waters. And that was when things were going to get interesting. May 28, 1944. Port-en-Bessin, France, German-occupied. Oberleutnant Klaus Richter of the 352nd Infantry Division walked the beach at dawn, his boots crunching on the pebbles. The Atlantic wall stretched in both directions: concrete bunkers, steel obstacles, mines. Thousands of mines. Rommel had ordered them planted everywhere. On the beaches, in the surf, even underwater at high tide. Herr Oberleutnant. A young soldier ran up, saluting. The underwater obstacles are complete. We've placed the last of the Belgian gates overnight. Richter nodded, scanning the horizon. The English Channel was grey and empty, as it had been every morning for months. Intelligence said the invasion was coming. Everyone knew it was coming. But when? And where? Good work, Schneider. Make sure the mines on the shallows are checked daily. The tides shift them. What Richter didn't know, what no German soldier along this entire coast knew, was that in less than 2 weeks, beneath the very waters he was watching, British engineers would begin laying a pipeline that would doom the Wehrmacht's defensive strategy. The Allies didn't need to capture ports intact. They were bringing their own fuel supply. June 3, 1944. Sandown Beach, Isle of Wight. The beach had transformed into a military anthill. 6 cable-laying ships sat at anchor: HMS Latimer, HMS Algerian, HMS Sancroft, HMS Holdfast, HMS Persephone, and the converted merchant vessel Empire Ridley. Each carried massive drums of Pluto pipe, along with the technical crews who'd spent the last 6 months learning to deploy it. Hartley stood in the operations tent, studying weather reports with a meteorologist from the RAF. Outside, the wind howled, driving rain against the canvas walls. Low pressure system, the meteorologist explained, pointing to the charts. Moved in yesterday. Won't clear until June 5th at the earliest, possibly the 6th. What about sea state? Currently force 5, gusting to force 6. Too rough for pipeline operations. Hartley's jaw tightened. D-Day was scheduled for June 5. Eisenhower had set the date based on tide conditions and moonlight for the paratroopers. The Pluto ships were supposed to follow the invasion fleet across, laying pipe as soon as the beaches were secured. But you couldn't lay pipeline in force 6 seas. The pipe would whip in the current, the drums would be impossible to control, and the cable-laying ships would roll too much for safe operations. Captain Passmore entered the tent, shaking water from his greatcoat. Weather's buggered the whole thing. Eisenhower's postponing. D-Day is now June 6, assuming the weather clears. And if it doesn't? Then we wait for the next favorable tide cycle. 2 weeks from now. Hartley did the math instantly. 2 weeks would be June 19th. That meant no fuel through Pluto until July at the earliest. The invasion forces would have to rely entirely on tanker ships and captured ports, exactly the vulnerable supply chain they'd built Pluto to avoid. It'll clear, Hartley said, with more confidence than he felt. Passmore gave him a look. You a meteorologist now? No. But I'm an engineer, and I know this. We've spent 6 months solving impossible problems. The weather's just one more. June 5, 1944. 9 p.m. hours. HMS Latimer, anchored off Sandown. The wind had dropped. Not much, still force 4, still choppy but enough. Keeble stood on the bridge, watching the invasion fleet assemble in the gathering dusk. Hundreds of ships. Thousands of landing craft. The largest armada in history, stretching from horizon to horizon. They're going tonight, his first officer said quietly. Tomorrow morning, Keeble corrected. They'll cross under darkness, hit the beaches at dawn. And Pluto would follow, as soon as word came that the beaches were secure. If the beaches were secured. Intelligence estimated 10,000 casualties in the first wave. Maybe more. Maybe much more. A signal lamp flashed from the shore. Keeble read the Morse. All ships stand by. Prepare for deployment orders. This is it, then, the first officer said. This is it. Below decks, the technical crew was running final checks on the pipe drum. The drum held 12 miles of 3-inch steel pipeline, enough to stretch from the Isle of Wight to the Normandy coast. Behind Latimer, 5 other ships carried their own drums. Together, they'd lay 6 parallel pipelines, redundancy that Hartley had insisted on. If one failed, 5 others would keep pumping. Keeble descended to the engine room, where Chief Engineer Thompson was nursing the drum's hydraulic system. Thompson looked up, his face streaked with grease. "She'll hold, sir. Laid cable from Gibraltar to Malta back in 41. This is just bigger cable, that's all. Cable doesn't carry petroleum at 200 psi. No, Thompson agreed, but the principle's the same. You pay it out steady, mind the tension, and don't let the drum bind. Done it 1,000 times. Keeble wanted to believe him, but he'd seen the test runs. He knew how many things could go wrong. A kink in the pipe. A rupture from excessive strain. The drum mechanism jamming. Mines that the minesweepers missed. German artillery finding the range. U-boats. Get some rest, Chief. We deploy at first light assuming there's a beachhead to deploy to. June 6, 1944. 6:30 hours. Omaha Beach, Normandy. The beach was hell. Staff Sergeant Mike Chen of the 1st Infantry Division crouched behind a destroyed Sherman tank, machine gun fire ripping overhead. Dead men lay everywhere in the surf, on the sand, piled against the seawall. The Wehrmacht's 352nd Division had turned Omaha into a killing ground. "We need fire support," someone screamed into a radio. "We're pinned down. We can't move." But the destroyers offshore were pounding the bluffs, and slowly agonizing gaps were opening in the German defenses. Engineers blew holes in the obstacles. Rangers scaled the cliffs. By noon, the Americans had established a toehold. By evening, they'd pushed half a mile inland. On Utah Beach, the landing went smoother. On Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches, British and Canadian forces fought their way off the sand and into the bocage country beyond. By nightfall on June 6, 156,000 Allied troops were ashore in France. But they'd burned through fuel at an alarming rate. Tanks idling in traffic jams. Trucks shuttling supplies from the beaches. Generators powering field hospitals and command posts. Every hour, the fuel dumps shrank. And Pluto still sat anchored off the Isle of Wight, waiting for the order to cross. June 8, 1944. 5 o'clock hours. HMS Latimer, English Channel. The order came at dawn. Proceed with Pluto deployment. Priority 1. Latimer's engines rumbled to life. Behind her, the other 5 cable layers formed a line, like ducklings following their mother. Escort destroyers flanked the HMS Wrestler and HMS Wensleydale, watching for U-boats and German surface raiders. Keeble stood on the bridge wing, binoculars raised, scanning the horizon. France was visible now, a dark line against the grey sky. Smoke rose from the invasion beach's fires still burning from 2 days of combat. "Course 270, he ordered. "Speed 4 knots. Signal the shore station, we're beginning deployment." On the fantail, the massive pipe drum began to rotate. The first section of Pluto slid down the deployment ramp, entering the channel with barely a splash. The pipe was negatively buoyant. It sank immediately, settling toward the seabed 60 feet below. "Pipe deployment commenced," the deck officer reported. "Tension nominal. Flow rate 0. Will pressurize once we reach the French coast." The ship crept forward. Behind the drum, the pipe unreeled steadily, a grey snake disappearing into the grey water. On shore, the Sandown pumping station's diesels started up, ready to push fuel through the line once the connection was complete. 1 mile paid out. 2 miles. 3. And then the radio crackled. "Contact. Submarine contact, bearing 090. HMS Wrestler peeled away, her ASDIC pinging. A U-boat had spotted the convoy. Within minutes, depth charges were thundering in the water, massive plumes of white spray erupting. "Keep laying," Keeble ordered. "Maintain course and speed." "Sir, if that U-boat dash, the destroyers will handle it. Our job is to lay this pipe." The drum continued rotating. 4 miles. 5 miles. The depth charges stopped. HMS Wrestler signaled. Submarine contact lost. Possible kill. Resuming escort station. 6 miles. The sun broke through the clouds, illuminating the invasion coast. You could see the ships, now hundreds of them, clustered offshore, landing craft shuttling back and forth, bigger vessels pumping supplies onto the beaches. The scale of it was staggering. 7 miles. 8 miles. Hartley's voice came over the radio from the shore station. "Latimer, how's the pipe integrity?" "No issues reported," Keeble replied. "Paying out smooth. You've got yourself an underwater pipeline, Mr. Hartley." "Not yet, I don't. Not until it reaches France and starts pumping." 9 miles. 10 miles. They were past the midpoint now, the channel's deepest section. The pipe was lying 90 fathoms down in places, invisible even to diving bells. If it ruptured here, they'd never recover it. They'd have to abandon this line and start over with one of the backup ships. 11 miles. A new voice broke onto the radio, American accent, military crisp. "British cable layer, this is USS Texas. You're entering our fire support zone. What the hell are you doing?" Texas was a battleship, her 14-inch guns supporting the troops ashore. From her perspective, Latimer was just a random merchant vessel wandering into a combat zone. "USS Texas, this is HMS Latimer," Keeble responded. "We're on authorized operations. Special Project Pluto. Check with SHAEF for clearance." A pause. Then, "Pluto? What the hell is dash?" Another pause. "Okay, we've got confirmation. You're clear to proceed. But stay out of our gun arcs. We're dropping shells on Point du Hoc in 30 minutes. Acknowledged. We'll be well clear by then." 12 miles. The French coast was growing larger. You could make out individual buildings now, or what was left of them. The bocage country beyond the infamous hedgerows that would make the next month of fighting a nightmare. A German artillery battery opened up from the cliffs, shells splashing into the water 200 yards to starboard. The destroyers returned fire immediately, their 5-inch guns hammering the German position. "Maintain course," Keeble ordered, his voice steady despite the shells falling around them. "Keep laying." 13 miles. 14 miles. They were in French waters now, technically occupied territory, though the Wehrmacht was too busy fighting for its life to contest one more ship. The artillery fell silent. The destroyers had knocked it out. 15 miles. 16 miles. The drum was visibly smaller now, most of its pipe paid out. Technicians crawled over it, checking for binding, ensuring smooth rotation. One mistake now, one jam in the mechanism, and the whole operation could fail. 17 miles. Latimer was approaching the designated landing point, a small beach east of Arromanches, away from the main fighting but close enough to the logistics network. Army engineers had cleared a section of beach, placing markers for the pipeline crews. 18 miles. 19 miles. 20 miles. The coast was close now, close enough to see individual soldiers moving on the beach. Landing craft were pulled up on the sand, their ramps down, supplies pouring out. Trucks rumbled inland on hastily built roads. The invasion was working. It was actually working. 21 miles. 22 miles. Beach contact in 3 minutes. Keeble watched through his binoculars as the shore crew prepared to receive the pipeline. They'd dug a trench from the water's edge to the receiving station, a concrete bunker the engineers had thrown up in 48 hours. The pipe would come ashore there, connect to pumps, and from there branch out to forward fuel dumps. Drum empty. All pipe deployed. A cheer went up from the crew. Latimer's engines reversed, holding position while small boats ferried the pipe end ashore. The shore crew grabbed it, hauling it up the beach like fishermen with the world's largest catch. "Connecting to shore pumps now," someone radioed. Hartley's voice, tense with anticipation, standing by to pressurize. "All stations report ready. Latimer ready. Shore station ready. Receiving station ready. Pressurizing in 3, 2, 1, now." The pumps at Sandown Beach engaged, their diesels roaring. 200 pounds per square inch of petroleum began moving through the pipe, travelling beneath the channel, flowing toward France at 4 miles per hour. For 10 minutes, nothing happened. The technical crew watched gauges, monitored pressures, held their breath. Then, on the French beach, a technician at the receiving station turned a valve. Fuel spurted out thick, brown petroleum, smelling of victory. "Flow confirmed," the technician shouted. "We have fuel in France. Pluto is operational." The cheering this time was unrestrained. On Latimer's deck, grown men embraced. In the shore station, Hartley allowed himself a smile. On the French beach, engineers who'd been fighting for 3 days without sleep laughed like madmen. They'd done it. They'd laid a pipeline across the English Channel. Under wartime conditions. While the Wehrmacht was actively trying to kill everyone involved. The impossible had become real. June 10, 1944. Forward fuel dump. Near Bayeux. Captain Jake Morrison of the 2nd Armored Division watched the fuel trucks arrive at his tank company's position. His Shermans had been stationary for 6 hours, waiting for fuel, and 6 hours in combat was an eternity. "About damn time," his driver muttered. The fuel truck pulled alongside, and a British petroleum engineer jumped down. "Sorry for the delay, Captain. We're still calibrating the flow rates. But you'll be happy to know this fuel came from England this morning." Morrison frowned. "Tanker ship?" "No, sir. Pipeline. Runs under the channel. Been pumping since yesterday. You're getting fuel faster than if we'd used ships." Morrison stared at him. "You're telling me there's a pipeline? Under the ocean?" "Yes, sir. 6 of them, actually. By week's end, we'll be pushing 1 million gallons a day through them. Your boys won't run dry again." Morrison watched the fuel flow into his Sherman's tank, thinking about supply lines and logistics and the insane genius it took to build a pipeline across an ocean floor during an invasion. "You British," he said finally, shaking his head, "are absolutely mad." The engineer grinned. "That's what the Germans keep saying, sir. That's what they keep saying." July 15, 1944. Pluto Control Station, Shanklin, Isle of Wight. The control room hummed with activity. Banks of gauges lined the walls, each one monitoring pressure, flow rate, and temperature across 6 separate pipelines now running beneath the channel. Arthur Hartley stood before the main display board, where colored lines tracked each pipeline's performance in real time. "Pressure spike on line 3, a technician called out. 230 psi and climbing. "Throttle back the Sandown pumps," Hartley ordered. "Compensate with lines 4 and 5. The technician adjusted valves, and the needle on the gauge slowly retreated to safe levels. This was the dance, now constant adjustment, balancing flow across multiple lines, responding to demand fluctuations as the armies advanced deeper into France. Bernard Ellis entered carrying a clipboard thick with reports. "Daily figures are in. We pushed 1.2 million gallons yesterday. That's 200,000 over target." Hartley allowed himself a small smile. "And the Boulogne extension?" "HMS Sancroft laid the first 3 miles this morning. If weather holds, we'll have a second pipeline route operational by month's end." They'd learned since June. Learned that redundancy saved lives. Learned that demand fluctuated wildly quiet days when the armies consolidated, then sudden surges when offensives launched. Learned that the channel was never truly conquered, only temporarily tamed. Line 2 had ruptured on June 23, probably from mine damage they'd missed on the survey. It took 4 days to locate the break and route around it using the backup lines. Line 5 developed a slow leak on July 3, not catastrophic, but enough to reduce flow by 20%. They'd isolated that section and increased pressure on the other lines. But the system worked. God help them, it actually worked. "Where's the fuel going today?" Hartley asked. Ellis consulted his sheets. "Patton's Third Army is making a push toward Avranches. They're burning through fuel like madmen, 800,000 gallons yesterday alone. Montgomery's forces are grinding through Karen. Another 400,000. The tactical air forces took 200,000 for their forward airfields. Hartley did the math. That's 1.4 million gallons in one day. Yes. And they're asking for more. Of course they are. Hartley walked to the window overlooking the pumping station. The diesels never stopped now, running 24 hours a day, pushing petroleum beneath the waves. Tell them we can do 1.5 million, but that's our absolute ceiling. Any more and we risk catastrophic failure across the entire network. I'll pass it along. Ellis paused. Arthur, you should know there's talk at SHAEF about giving you a medal. I don't want a medal. I want these pipelines to keep running until we're in Berlin. August 3, 1944. Near Avranches, France. The breakout had begun. General Patton's Third Army was pouring through the gap at Avranches, tanks racing across France at a pace that left supply officers gasping. Behind the armored spearheads, a river of trucks carried fuel, ammunition, and supplies forward, and every one of those trucks was burning fuel that came through Pluto. Captain Morrison's Sherman Company had covered 60 miles in 2 days, a pace unthinkable in previous campaigns. They'd stopped for refueling at a forward dump near Mortain, where Morrison struck up a conversation with a supply colonel who looked like he hadn't slept in a week. "How the hell are you keeping us supplied?" Morrison asked. "We're moving faster than the supply chain should allow." The colonel gestured toward a line of fuel trucks being filled from underground tanks. "That pipeline from England, Pluto, they call it, changed everything. We're not dependent on captured ports anymore. We're not waiting for tanker convoys. The fuel just flows continuously, like turning on a tap." He pulled out a map marked with supply routes. "See these lines? Each one represents a fuel pipeline branching off from the main Pluto network. We've laid over 300 miles of secondary pipe across France. Fuel goes from England to Normandy in 12 hours, then distributes to forward dumps in another 6. Your tanks are running on petroleum that was under England yesterday morning." Morrison shook his head in wonder. Back in North Africa, we'd advance 50 miles and then sit for a week waiting for fuel to catch up. Now we're covering 50 miles a day and never running dry. Welcome to the future of warfare, Captain. Logistics just became the weapon that wins wars. August 12, 1944. Pluto Control Station. The alarm shrieked at 3 o'clock hours. Hartley bolted upright in his cot he'd taken to sleeping in the control station, unable to be more than 30 seconds from the gauges. "What is it?" he shouted, pulling on his trousers. A technician met him at the control room door, face pale. Line 1 and Line 4. Both showing 0 pressure. Complete failure. Hartley's blood went cold. 2 lines down simultaneously meant either catastrophic equipment failure or German sabotage. "Don't know yet, sir. It happened suddenly. One moment normal operation, next moment nothing." Hartley ran to the display board. Lines 1 and 4 were indeed flatlined. But lines 2, 3, 5, and 6 were operating normally, compensating automatically for the lost capacity. "Get Keeble on the radio. I need diving teams on both lines immediately. And reroute all distribution to the working lines. We can't let the armies run dry." What followed was 12 hours of frantic investigation. HMS Latimer deployed divers at 6 different points along Line 1. HMS Sancroft did the same on Line 4. The channel was rough force 5 seas, making the work dangerous and slow. At 3 p.m. hours, the answer came back: "Sir, we've found the problem. Both lines were severed, cut clean through about 8 miles offshore." Cut. Hartley's mind raced. By what? Best guess. Ship's anchor. "We've got a freighter reported dragging anchor through this area 2 nights ago during that storm. Must have snagged both pipes and severed them." An accident, then. Not sabotage. Not a deliberate attack. Just bad luck and worse weather. "Can we repair them?" "Not underwater, sir. We'd need to cut out the damaged sections and splice in new pipe. That's a week's work minimum, probably 2. Hartley looked at the remaining 4 lines on the display board. They were carrying 1.3 million gallons per day, below the Army's needs, but sustainable if operations slowed even slightly. Isolate the damaged sections. Seal the ends to prevent contamination. We'll operate on 4 lines until we can effect repairs. He paused, doing calculations in his head. And someone find out what ship dragged that anchor. I want to have words with their captain. September 8, 1944. Somewhere in Belgium. The Allied armies were racing across France and into Belgium. Paris had been liberated. Brussels was next. The Wehrmacht was in full retreat, and every mile of that retreat was fueled by Pluto. But the pipeline's limits were showing. The armies had outrun even Pluto's reach. Engineers were now laying auxiliary lines from the Normandy terminals deeper into France, trying to keep pace with Patton and Montgomery. It was like trying to extend a garden hose while someone was running away with the nozzle. At SHAEF headquarters, logistics officers were performing calculations that would have been impossible 6 months earlier. Pluto delivered 42 million gallons in August, one officer reported to Eisenhower's staff. That's more than we could have landed by tanker ships, even without U-boat losses. It's single-handedly keeping the advance going. What about September projections? Demands increasing. We're now pushing 1.6 million gallons per day through 4 operational lines. That's above design specifications. The engineers say we're risking catastrophic failure. Tell the engineers to keep pushing. If Pluto fails, we fail. It's that simple. Back at the Isle of Wight, Hartley received these demands with grim acceptance. They were operating beyond safe limits. The pipes were under more pressure than they'd ever been designed for. The pumps were running hot. Something would fail. It was just a question of when and how catastrophically. We can give them 1.6 for another month, he told Ellis. After that, we need to reduce flow or start replacing worn-out sections. They won't accept reduced flow. Then they'd better start capturing German fuel depots, because Pluto can't work miracles forever. October 20th, 1944. Pluto Control Station. The knock came at dawn. Hartley opened the door to find Captain Passmore standing there, his face carefully neutral. Mr. Hartley, I've been asked to inform you that as of 6 o'clock hours today, Pluto has delivered its 100 millionth gallon of petroleum to the European continent. Hartley blinked. 100 million. Yes. We've been keeping count since June 8th. 100 million gallons. The equivalent of 500 tanker ships. Without losing a single drop to U-boats or air attack. Passmore's neutral expression cracked into a smile. I believe congratulations are in order. Hartley stepped outside. The morning was clear, the channel visible from the control station. Somewhere beneath those waves, for steel pipes were humming with petroleum, feeding an army, fueling a liberation. It's not me, Hartley said quietly. It's Keeble and his diving teams. Ellis and the welders. Webb and the pipe manufacturers. Thompson and 1,000 other engineers who made this work. It's all of you, Passmore corrected. And speaking of which, he handed over an envelope bearing official seals. This came from London. Hartley opened it. Inside was a brief letter informing him that His Majesty King George VI had awarded him the Order of the British Empire for services to the war effort. He read it twice, then carefully folded it and put it in his pocket. That's nice, he said simply. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have gauges to monitor. May 8, 1945. Pluto Control Station. The war in Europe was over. Germany had surrendered. The diesels at Sandown Beach had been throttled back to idle, the pipelines depressurized for the first time in 11 months. Hartley stood in the control room quiet now, almost eerily so after months of constant activity reading the final operations report. The numbers were staggering. Total petroleum delivered, 172 million gallons. Peak daily flow, 1.8 million gallons, exceeded design specifications by 80%. Total operational days, 335. Number of complete line failures, 3. Repair time averaged, 8 days. Equivalent tanker ships saved, 860. Estimated lives saved by eliminating tanker vulnerability, 4,200 sailors. But those were just numbers. The real story was in the smaller details. The welders who worked underwater in zero visibility. The pump operators who nursed failing equipment through one more day. The cable layers who deployed pipe under fire. The logistics officers who routed fuel to where it was needed most. The engineers who'd been told something was impossible and built it anyway. Keeble entered, looking years older than the lieutenant commander who'd stood in icy channel water back in January 1944. They're asking what to do with the pipelines. Recover them or leave them in place. Hartley considered. The pipes were worn now, some sections near failure, but they'd lasted when it mattered. Leave them. Let them be a monument to what's possible when you refuse to accept impossible. Poetic. But what do I actually tell the Admiralty? Tell them recovery costs more than the pipe is worth. Which is true. Keeble smiled. That it is. Marcus Webb arrived next, followed by Bernard Ellis and John Loberg, the core team that had turned a mad idea into reality. They gathered in the control room, this space that had been the beating heart of Pluto for so long. We did it, Ellis said. We actually bloody did it. Did you ever doubt? Hartley asked. Every single day, Ellis admitted. Every pressure spike, every storm, every time the Germans shelled a landing beach. I was certain we'd fail. But we didn't, Webb added. Because failure wasn't an option. Men were dying for lack of fuel, and we had the means to deliver it. So we did. Loberg, who'd trained scores of welders in underwater techniques, nodded slowly. My father was a fisherman. In Norway. He used to say the sea always wins in the end. But I think we won this time. For a little while, at least, we beat the sea. They stood in silence, looking at the gauges that had dominated their lives. Pressure at 0. Flow at 0. The pumps silent. But the memory of what they'd accomplished, that would never be silent. November 12, 1945. Combined Operations Headquarters, London. The meeting room was the same one where Hartley had first proposed Pluto exactly 2 years earlier. But the faces were different now, some promoted, some transferred, some dead in the war that had finally ended. Admiral Mountbatten stood at the head of the table, reading from a prepared statement. Operation PLUTO represents one of the most significant engineering achievements in military history. Without it, the invasion of Europe would have stalled for lack of fuel. Without it, thousands more sailors would have died on tanker convoys. Without it, the war might have lasted another year. He looked up from his papers. Mr. Hartley, when you proposed a pipeline across the channel, most men in this room thought you were mad. I know I did. But you proved that the impossible is just the possible that hasn't been attempted yet. Hartley stood, uncomfortable with the attention. Admiral, if I may, Pluto worked because we treated it not as one impossible problem, but as 1,000 solvable ones. Each weld, each pressure test, each pipeline section was solvable. String enough solved problems together, and you get the impossible. That's a philosophy that should guide us in peacetime as well, Mountbatten said. We're going to rebuild a continent. That seems impossible too. But if we can lay pipelines under the channel, we can rebuild Europe. The meeting concluded with handshakes and congratulations. But afterward, Hartley slipped away, back to the Isle of Wight one last time. November 13, 1945. Sandown Beach, Isle of Wight. The pumping station was being decommissioned. The diesels were being removed, the pipes capped, the whole facility prepared for demolition. In a few months, this beach would be a tourist resort again, and only a few concrete foundations would hint at what had happened here. Hartley walked to the water's edge, where the pipelines had entered the channel. You couldn't see them now. They were invisible, buried under sand and sediment, already beginning their slow decay beneath the waves. But they'd been real. For 11 months, they'd been the most important fuel supply line in the world. They'd fed an army. They'd liberated a continent. They'd proven that engineers could accomplish anything if they refused to accept no for an answer. A voice behind him, reflecting on past glories, Mr. Hartley. He turned to find a young soldier, probably just demobilized, skipping stones into the surf. Something like that, Hartley replied. What happened here, anyway? My sergeant said they built some kind of secret weapon on this beach. Not a weapon. A pipeline. Ran all the way to France, under the water. The soldier laughed. Come on, really? A pipeline under the sea? That's impossible. Hartley smiled, really smiled, for the first time in months. Yes, he said quietly. Yes, it was. He took one last look at the channel, grey and restless as always, keeping its secrets. Then he turned and walked back toward the car that would take him to London, to civilian life, to a world where the impossible would have to become possible all over again. Behind him, the waves rolled in, eternal and uncaring, covering the greatest engineering achievement no one would ever see. But it had been real. And that was enough.